Welcome to the nutrient calculator for high rainfall pastures in Western Australia. This calculator will enable you to determine soil fertiliser rates based on a standard soil test. In order to use the calculator, you will need some basic soil parameters, which include pH and calcium chloride, Colwell P, Colwell K, and KCl40 sulfur. You will also need to determine your soil texture and your yield target. Relative yield or yield target is an important input for the nutrient calculator. It is a percentage estimate of the maximum production possible from a paddock. For example, if you are looking at two paddocks, one may produce 10 tonnes per hectare and another may produce 8 tonnes per hectare of pasture dry matter. However, for both paddocks, you may be aiming for a yield target that is less than 100%. For example, 80, 90 or 95% of the maximum production for each paddock. The yield target may vary between paddocks and farming systems. However, as a rough guide, a standard beef grazing enterprise may have a yield target of 70 to 85%. An intensive rotationally grazed property, including dairies and paddocks cut for hay and silage, may have a 90 to 95% yield target, whereas properties running low stocking rates may have a yield target less than 70%. So here we have the opening window for the calculator. If we go through, we can hit Add Paddock, and you are presented with this window. And this is where you input your soil parameters from your soil test. However, before we get into this, I might just open up the legend, which explains the colour scheme and various parameters that are in the calculator. So, for the macronutrients, phosphorus, potassium and sulfur, red means low, orange is optimal, and green is high soil nutrient status. For pH, very low is red, low is brown, light green is marginal, and dark green is okay for acidity. You will also see there is some dark and grey bars. I'll explain what those indicate in a moment. So let's populate these fields with the information for your paddock from your soil test. The first thing you need to do is give the paddock a name, then select the texture from a field assessment. You then input the pH and calcium chloride and your PBI or phosphorus buffering index. Then you add your Colwell P, your Colwell K, and your KCl40 sulfur test in milligrams per kilogram. The next step is to click on this down arrow and you'll then be presented with a number of fields. One of particular note is the yield target. If we click on this, you will see that you can choose a yield target or relative yield of between 50 and 99% of maximum production on that paddock. This number, combined with the status of your paddocks for P, K and S, the PBI and the soil texture, will be used by the calculator to determine if that paddock is sufficient, marginal or deficient in P, K or S. So for instance, if we select 80% relative yield, you can see that the phosphorus is now sufficient, the potassium is marginal, and the sulfur has become sufficient. If we go back to 90%, you can see it reverts back. So we'll leave it at 90% for the time being. We know that the red colour indicates a deficiency, and in this case, phosphorus and potassium are deficient. However, we do have these dark and grey bars. So the dark bar under the potassium is indicating that potassium is the primary deficiency, and the grey bar indicates that phosphorus is the secondary deficiency or constraint. The grey bar under the pH is a little different. This is indicating that if you were to lime this paddock and bring the pH up to 5.5, which is the agronomic pH target, you are moderately likely to increase the availability of P or phosphorus. However, given that potassium is the primary deficiency or constraint, let's have a look at what our options are for that. You click on this menu here and you can see a range of fertiliser options. You have murate of potash, sulphate of potash, and a range of super potash blends. So if we look at selecting murate of potash initially, we can see that we now have a number that has appeared in this field. So what the calculator has done is it's used the amount of potassium in murate of potash, and if we click on these three dots, you can see we have a breakdown of the phosphorus, potassium and sulphur in this particular fertiliser. The calculator uses this number combined with the nutrient status, the soil texture and the yield target to come up with the amount of murate of potash required to deal with the deficiency. If we click on these three dots below the soil potassium field, we'll get some additional information. It is telling us that we have enough potassium in the soil currently to support a yield target of 78.6%, and that we need to reach a soil potassium level of 105, and that currently we have a fertility index of 0.67, or that we have 67% of the potassium required for a 90% yield target. The calculator is also indicating that we will need to apply 35 kilograms of K or potassium to reach the yield target of 90%. If we click on the three dots below this field here, this gives us an indication again of how much potassium we are supplying with the murate of potash, and how much phosphorus and sulphur we are adding with this particular fertiliser, which in this case is 0, because murate of potash has no phosphorus and no sulphur in it. It is also telling us how much phosphorus and sulphur surplus or deficit we have by using our chosen fertiliser to address the potassium needs. From this, we know that we need phosphorus and sulphur. We know phosphorus is deficient, and that is our secondary constraint. So we can go back to our fertiliser list, and we have a number of options here, so let's select superphosphate. Like the potassium, we can click on the three dots and we can see the breakdown of phosphorus, potassium and sulphur in superphosphate. Super has 9.1% P, it's got 0 K and 10.5% sulphur. The calculator is using these percentages combined with what's in the soil and the yield target to determine how much fertiliser you're going to need. So for the phosphorus demand, it's saying we need 176 kilograms per hectare of superphosphate. And for the sulphur demand, we would require 105 kilograms per hectare of superphosphate. However, this would not be our preferred way of dealing with the sulphur if that was our only issue. In this case, we need the phosphorus, and the sulphur is just something we're getting extra, which is fine. There is another way to handle this though, given that we need both phosphorus and potassium. You have some other options in here with the super potash blends. If we look at the range that we have 2-in-1 and also possibly 3-in-1, which is pretty close. And we've also got 3-in-2, which is getting further apart. So what I'm looking at here is the difference in fertiliser rate between the phosphorus and the potassium. If we can get those reasonably close, and that's probably as close as we're going to get them, we could potentially get away with a one-shot blend. So again, if we click on the three dots, we can see that 3-in-1 has 6.8% P, 12.4% potassium and 7.9% sulphur. So to meet the phosphorus demand, we need 235 kilos of 3-in-1. If we click on the three dots, we can see we're getting the 16 kilograms of P that we need. We're a little under on the K, but we're probably so close that we could live with that. We're overshooting on the sulphur, but again, that's not a major issue. So you can see you can use this to play with different options in these blends and potentially come up with a solution. The only cautionary note is, of course, every paddock may be different. One blend may work for one paddock, but maybe not the other. And that's where potentially looking at superphosphate with a second application of something like murate is potentially another way to go, but it depends on the situation. So we've finished with this paddock now. If you wish to add another paddock, you simply click the Add Paddock button, and you're presented with a whole bunch of new fields which you will fill in as before. You can add up to 100 paddocks. The important thing to note is that all of this information that you have added will be lost if you close the calculator without exporting the paddocks. To do that, you click on these 3 lines and you're presented with a number of options. Export paddocks is the one to choose. You click that button and it will export an Excel file onto your computer that includes all of the information you've added, including your fertiliser options. Save it somewhere on your computer that you can find later when you open the calculator again. You then select Import Paddocks, import that file, and all of your information will be there in the calculator. Now there's some other options in here as well. You can change your colors if you wish. You can also create a report. So if you hit the Create Report button, you can have a basic report, which is essentially just the soil status, or you can hit Advanced Report and it will download this. The report includes not only the soil status, but all of your fertilizer options and all of the extra information under each of the fields. It's 1 page per paddock and is a good permanent record of your paddocks and your selected options. So in summary, the nutrient calculator allows you to determine your soil nutrient status and potential fertilizer options based on a standard WA soil test. Just remember, for this calculator to be useful, you must have a soil test that includes pH in calcium chloride, phosphorus buffering index, Colwell P, Colwell K, and KCl40S, all in milligrams per kilogram. Don't be afraid to play with your yield targets, because that will give you a very good feel for how that influences the amount of fertilizer you need. And also remember that in the calculator, red means you are deficient. You need to apply that nutrient. Orange is optimal, so you may need a very small amount, and green means you are sufficient. If it is green, you don't need that nutrient. Finally, the calculator is only as good as the soil sample you take. Make sure you take a representative soil sample and follow the Fit for Purpose soil sampling guide available on the Fertiliser Australia website, or watch the Fit for Purpose soil sampling video available on the Deep Herd Pasture Management YouTube playlist. The QR code at the end of the video will take you to a range of resources. I hope you found this video useful. If you have any further questions, feel free to contact your local Deep Herd office or your local participating catchment group.